History taught you about Viking raiders, wild, individualistic warriors who fought for plunder and died for glory. But here's what they never taught you in school. There was one Viking brotherhood so disciplined, so fanatically devoted to each other, that their code demanded they die before retreat. They were forbidden to show fear, forbidden to flee, bound by laws harsher than any modern military. And when they lost a battle, they lined up to be executed and laughed in the face of their killers. They were the Jomsvikings, and their story is darker than anything you've learned about the Viking Age. Let's start with geography, because like every Viking story that matters, geography is where everything begins. Look at the southern shore of the Baltic Sea in the late 10th century. This was the frontier, where Norse raiders met Slavic traders, where pagan gods clashed with a rising Christian tide. Somewhere along this coastline, on an island or a peninsula shrouded in fog, stood a fortress called Jomsborg. And here's the first thing history can't agree on. We don't know exactly where Jomsborg was. Historians have argued for centuries. Some say the island of Wolin in modern Poland. Others point to entirely different locations. We have no ruins that definitively say Jomsborg was here. Think about that. The most feared warriors of the late Viking Age lived in a fortress we still cannot find. But here's what we do know. According to the sagas, Jomsborg was no ordinary stronghold. Its harbor could hold anywhere from 30 to 300 longships. Its walls were manned by warriors who answered to no king, no jarl, no one except their own brotherhood. And inside those walls lived a code so strict, it makes modern special forces look lenient. Who founded it? The sagas disagree. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus says King Harald Bluetooth himself, the same Harald who unified Denmark, conquered the settlement and gave it to a Swedish prince named Styrbjorn the Strong. Other accounts point to a legendary chieftain named Palnatoke. What every source agrees on is this: Jomsborg was built for war, and the men inside it were unlike anything the Viking world had ever seen. Now forget everything you think you know about Viking warriors, because the Jomsvikings were the complete opposite. To even apply, you had to be between 18 and 50 years old. You had to prove your valor, usually through a ritual duel to the death with an existing member. If you lost, you died. If you won, you were in. There was one exception in the entire history of the Brotherhood. A boy named Vang Åkesson showed up at Jomsborg at the age of 12 and demanded to join. The Jomsvikings laughed. They put him against their leader, Sigvaldi Strut Haraldsson, in single combat, expecting the boy to be humiliated. Instead, Vang won. At 12 years old, he became the youngest Jomsviking in history. Let me know in the comments, would you have let a 12-year-old join your warrior brotherhood? The Jomsvikings did, and Vang almost immediately took their leader's job. But here's where it gets darker. Once you were in, you lived by 7 laws. The first few sound harsh, but survivable. By the 7th, you'll understand why no army on earth could break these men. First law: no women, no children. Not inside the fortress walls, not as captives. Historians still debate whether members could have wives outside the fortress, but inside Jomsborg, the Brotherhood was everything. Your loyalty was to your fellow warriors, not to your family, not to your gods, not even to yourself. Second law: no cowardice, no fear. And here is the rule that still echoes through history. You were forbidden to flee from an enemy of equal or inferior strength. Retreat when vastly outnumbered, that was permitted. Retreat when evenly matched, that was death. Third law: no absence from the fortress for more than 3 days without permission. Fourth law: no quarreling with your brothers. If a blood feud erupted between members, officers had to mediate it. Fifth law: you were bound to avenge a fallen brother, no matter the cost. Sixth law: all spoils of battle were divided equally among the entire Brotherhood. No hoarding, no selfishness. The man who killed a king and the man who killed a farmer walked away with the same share. Seventh law, you did not leave the Brotherhood. There was no retirement, no resignation. Once you were a Jomsviking, you died a Jomsviking. Think about what this means. In a Viking world built on individual glory, where warriors competed to carve their names into legend, the Jomsvikings erased the individual entirely. You were not a hero. You were a piece of a machine. And that machine was designed for one purpose: war. If this code is already more brutal than anything you expected from Viking history, hit that like button, because the darkest part of this story hasn't even started yet. Here's what matters. The Jomsvikings were not a religious order. They worshipped Odin and Thor, but they would fight for Christian kings if the price was right. They were mercenaries, the world's first private military company, 900 years before the term existed. Any lord with enough silver could hire them, and any lord who did not pay learned what happened when the world's deadliest warriors became your enemy. Every one of these laws was preparing them for a single moment, the moment a stranger walked toward them with an axe, and they did not flinch, did not beg, did not break. We're getting there, but first, you need to see what happens when the code meets the battlefield. Around 984 CE, the exiled Swedish prince Styrbjorn the Strong came to Jomsborg. His uncle, King Eric the Victorious, had driven him from Sweden. Styrbjorn wanted his throne back, and he wanted the Jomsvikings to get it for him. The Brotherhood agreed. They sailed to Sweden with a massive fleet. They met King Eric's army at a place called the Fýrisvellir, the plains of Fýris, near Uppsala. And here is where legend bleeds into history. The sagas claim King Eric made a pact with Odin himself. He promised the god of war that if Eric won, he would sacrifice himself to Odin in 10 years. In exchange, Odin would give him victory. What we know for certain is this: the Jomsvikings lost. Catastrophically. Styrbjorn fell. The Brotherhood was shattered. But what survived the battle is just as important as who died. 3 rune stones from this exact period still stand in Sweden today: the Högby runestone, the Hellestad runestone, and the Sjörup runestone. The Sjörup stone carries a single line that tells you everything about what it meant to be a Jomsviking. It reads, "He did not flee at Uppsala, but slaughtered as long as he had a weapon." Read that again. He did not flee. The highest honor, the only honor, not victory, not survival, standing your ground until your weapon hand failed. Stories like this, the ones the sagas buried and the history books skip, that's what this channel is built on. If you want more warrior cultures they erased from history, hit subscribe, because what happened at the execution line makes Fýrisvellir look like a skirmish. The Jomsvikings were finished. Their leader was dead, their fleet destroyed. Any sane brotherhood would have disbanded, and for a moment, it seemed like they had. But less than 2 years later, they sailed again, into waters far darker than the ones that had just swallowed them. 986 CE, less than 2 years after the Uppsala disaster. Before I tell you what happened on that log, I want you to imagine something. You've just watched a supernatural storm tear your fleet apart. Your brothers are dead around you. Your hands are bound behind your back. You're on your knees in the mud. And a stranger is walking toward you carrying an axe. What do? The Jomsvikings, now recovering and reorganized, turned their eyes north. Their target was Norway, specifically Håkon Jarl, the de facto ruler. Håkon was a powerful man, a pagan like them, but he was also a political obstacle, and the Jomsvikings were being paid to remove him. The Brotherhood assembled a fleet and sailed into Norwegian waters. Håkon Jarl learned of their approach and gathered his own ships. The two forces met at a place called Hjörungavágr, a strait on the western coast of Norway. And then something happened that the saga writers could not explain without invoking the supernatural. A storm descended on the battle. Not just any storm. The Jomsvikings saga describes hail the size of fists smashing into the Jomsviking ships, wind that tore sails from their rigging, waves that made fighting impossible. The storms seemed to target only one side, the Jomsvikings. Some accounts claim Håkon Jarl sacrificed his own 7-year-old son to his patron goddess Thorgerðr Holgabrúðr in exchange for the storm. Other sources say he prayed to her and she answered. What we know is that the Jomsvikings, already outnumbered, now fought nature itself. And they lost. The battle turned into a rout. Dozens of Jomsvikings were captured alive. And what happened next is the reason their name still echoes through history. Håkon Jarl ordered the prisoners executed one by one. They were lined up on a log, their hands bound, their heads stretched forward. An axe waited for each of them. The first Jomsviking knelt and said nothing as the axe fell. The second knelt and said nothing. The third knelt and said nothing. But as the executions continued, something changed. The Jomsvikings did not beg. They did not weep. They did not show fear. Instead, they started competing for who could die with the most defiance. One warrior asked to be struck from the front rather than from behind because he wanted to look his killer in the eyes. The most famous account tells of a young warrior who, as the axe was raised, lifted his own long hair with his bound hands and said, "Do not bloody my hair." The executioner obliged, and the young man died smiling. But here is where it gets even more extraordinary. The executions stopped, not because Håkon Jarl showed mercy, because his men refused to continue. Norwegian warriors who had seen a lifetime of violence were unnerved by the Jomsvikings' utter contempt for death. Håkon, enraged, ordered the killings to resume, but the damage was done. Some Jomsvikings, including Vagn Åkesson, the boy who had defeated their leader at age 12, were spared. Think about that. They were so unbreakable that their killers could not finish the job. The Norwegians had won the battle, but the Jomsvikings had won something else entirely, the legend. I asked you earlier what you would have done on that log. Drop your answer in the comments, because the Jomsvikings' answer is why we're still talking about them 1,000 years later. In a moment, I'm going to tell you about a betrayal so controversial that 1,000 years later, historians still cannot agree on why it happened. But first, you need to understand the man they betrayed, because once you know who Olaf Tryggvason really was, the betrayal might look less like treachery and more like something else entirely. The year 1000, the Battle of Svolder, a sea battle between the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason and a coalition of his enemies, the kings of Denmark and Sweden. The Jomsvikings, led by Sigvaldi Jarl, had been hired to fight alongside King Olaf. But at the decisive moment, Sigvaldi Jarl pulled his ships away. He abandoned King Olaf to his enemies. Olaf's fleet was surrounded and destroyed. Olaf himself leaped into the sea in full armor, choosing death over capture. Why did Sigvaldi do it? The sagas disagree. Some say it was pure treachery, that Sigvaldi had been bribed. Others suggest a different motive altogether. Olaf Tryggvason was the most aggressive Christianizer Norway had ever seen. He forced entire regions to convert at sword point. He burned pagan temples. He killed those who refused baptism. The Jomsvikings worshipped the old gods, Odin, Thor, the pantheon of the Norse warrior. They may have fought for Christian lords when the money was right, but perhaps Olaf Tryggvason had crossed a line. Perhaps the destruction of their faith was a price too high. Here is the dark irony, though. The Danish king who won the Norwegian throne at Svolder, Sweyn Forkbeard, had already been baptized. The man the Jomsvikings helped put on Norway's throne was a Christian, and the faith they may have betrayed Olaf to protect ultimately consumed their world anyway. Here's the question historians still cannot answer, and I want your take in the comments. Was Sigvaldi a traitor who sold out his ally for silver, or a pagan defending the old gods from a king who burned their temples? The evidence points both ways. Tell me which one you believe. Here's the thing about the sagas. They were written by Christians, for Christians, about pagans who terrified them. If Sigvaldi betrayed Olaf to defend the old gods, the saga writers had every reason to call it treason instead. And that's exactly what they did. 1043 CE, the end of the Jomsvikings. King Magnus the Good of Norway had consolidated his power. He looked south across the Baltic and saw Jomsborg, this fortress of mercenaries who fought for gold, not for nations, as a threat that could not be tolerated. Magnus sailed to the Baltic with a fleet of his own. He sacked Jomsborg, burned it to the ground, killed those who resisted, dispersed the survivors. The Brotherhood that had terrorized the seas for decades was gone. No chronicler wrote their epitaph. No kingdom mourned them. They were mercenaries, loyal only to each other, and when they fell, the world moved on quickly. For 971 years, that was the end of the story. Until the autumn of 2014, a golden disc was rediscovered in Sweden, part of a Viking hoard originally found in 1841 in the village of Wiakowo, near Wolin in Poland. The disc weighs 25 grams and is made of pure gold, and on its surface is an inscription. Harald Gormson, King of the Danes, Scania, Jomsborg, Diocese of Oldenburg. Harald Gormson, Harald Bluetooth, the king who, according to the sagas, was one of the founders of the Jomsvikings. And here, on a disc of gold buried for 1,000 years, was his name and the name of the fortress itself, Jomsborg. The disc is called the Kurmsund disc. It does not prove the sagas got everything right. Historians still debate how much of the Jomsviking story is legend and how much is history. But the disc tells us something crucial. Jomsborg was real enough to be named alongside Denmark and Scania on a royal artifact. The Jomsvikings were not a fable. Here's what 971 years of history did to the Jomsvikings. It dismissed them as myth, until a golden disc forced historians to admit they were wrong. And here's what that disc cannot tell you. The Jomsvikings were a contradiction, and that contradiction is what makes them unforgettable. They were mercenaries who fought for gold, but they lived by a code stricter than any king's army. They were pagans who fought for Christian lords. They were warriors who refused to retreat and died laughing at their executioners. And here is the final truth they never taught you. The Jomsviking code did not survive them. No modern military adopted their laws. No nation claims their lineage. They left no dynasty, no empire, no descendants to carry their name. But they left us something else, a story. A story about warriors who believed that how you died mattered more than whether you lived. Warriors who refused to kneel, refused to beg, refused to break, even when the axe was already falling. And that story has outlasted every kingdom they fought for. If these hidden warrior facts blew your mind, hit the like button and subscribe. It would really help this channel as we uncover the warrior cultures they erased from history. And in the comments, if you were on that log, hands bound, axe behind you, what would you have said?